I still remember the first time I set foot in the specialized overnight unit of our urban hospital, a labyrinth of quiet hallways and muted tones that, on the surface, appeared benign. I was a resident doctor, freshly assigned to observing care for long-term patients who occupied rooms that lay in the unspoken margins of the hospital. There was an unanticipated melancholy in that unit, a heavy silence that went beyond the ordinary exhaustion of night shifts. At first, I chalked it up to the loneliness of the late hours and the weary resignation of patients nearing the ends of their journeys. But it didn't take long for me to sense that something far more profound was at work here, a mystery that seemed to seep into the very walls of the building. My nights began with the relentless hum of machines and the steady, occasional beep of a monitor registering a life quietly ticking on. The lights were dimmed to a comforting level, yet in that semi-darkness, the halls took on a surreal quality. At times, I felt as if I were walking through the corridors of a memory rather than a living institution, as if every footstep echoed the lost voices of those long past. I remember passing by an old, slightly tarnished mirror in the nurse's station and catching a glimpse of a shadow that wasn't entirely my own, a fleeting, unaccountable presence that left me unsettled long after I had resumed my rounds. As the nights progressed, the unit began to reveal subtle signs of an unseen history. I first noticed it on a humid summer night when the hum of the air conditioning was abruptly replaced by a series of soft murmurs. I was reviewing patient files near a window when a voice, barely a whisper, murmured my name. I spun around quickly, heart hammering in my chest, only to find the room empty, save for the flickering light of my desk lamp. That night, sleep was elusive, chased away by the persistent feeling that the very air was charged with unspoken secrets. I tried to convince myself that it had to be the product of exhaustion or a trick of acoustics, but the feeling grew stronger with each passing shift. I began to notice other inexplicable occurrences. The old clock in the corridor inexplicably stopped at precisely 3:07 a.m. on several nights. The temperature would drop suddenly in an empty room, and I found several old personal mementos, a locket, a faded handkerchief, a name engraved on a piece of worn-out wood, appearing in places where they shouldn't be. It was as if remnants of the past were making their silent, spectral return. Every now and then, while making my routine rounds, I would catch a glimpse of a figure in the corner of my eye, a hazy outline of a person whose presence stirred both sorrow and curiosity. I soon deduced that these encounters weren't random illusions cast by my tired mind, but the deliberate, albeit cryptic, echoing of a story that had long ago been silenced by the cold indifference of a broken system. One night, after an exhausting shift filled with fleeting apparitions and disembodied voices, I found solace in the quiet solitude of the administrative corridor. I huddled over a collection of old patient files, yellowed and nearly worn to nothingness, trying to piece together the puzzle of the unit's past. What I unearthed was a series of tragic narratives, individual lives that had faded from institutional memory without so much as a proper farewell. There was Mrs. Aldridge, a woman whose gentle smile belied the deep sadness of her final days. Mr. Hargrove, whose eyes once sparkled with dreams now permanently closed, and many other souls whose names barely left a trace in the modern records. As I read each story, I felt their silent voices merging into one collective whisper, an echo that seemed to saturate every corner of the unit. I began to wonder if the murmurs I heard were not mere products of my imagination, but rather the accumulated grief and regret of all those forgotten by time. Then, on an unusually heavy night, I experienced the phenomenon that defied every rational explanation I had clung to so far. After a long day filled with meticulous charting and brief, anxious conversations with patients and their family members, I sat alone in one of the subdued waiting areas between treatment zones. I found myself enveloped by an inexplicable melancholy, as if I had stepped into someone else's private memory. In the distance, the soft strains of what sounded like a piano playing a sorrowful melody reached me, a tune so evocative that it brought tears to my eyes. I followed the sound with a mix of dread and desperate curiosity, passing through corridors that seemed to stretch on far longer than I remembered. At the source, I discovered nothing more than a spare break room with peeling wallpaper and a solitary, dusty window. Yet, as I lingered there, the haunting melody grew louder, each note resonating with the heartbeat of long-forgotten souls. I soon became convinced that the music was not produced by any ordinary means. It was as if the walls themselves were singing in a language of loss, a lament for the lives that had passed by unnoticed. In the following weeks, the mysterious occurrences escalated, and so did the intensity of my introspection. The voices in the unit grew bolder in their insistence that I needed to remember, to acknowledge something that had been buried beneath years of forgetfulness and negligence. I started to document every occurrence meticulously, logging every whisper, temperature drop, and shadow that moved in a way that defied the predictable rhythms of the night. What began as academic curiosity slowly transformed into an obsession, a need to unravel the hidden tapestry woven into the fabric of the hospital's history. I reached out to some of the long-standing nurses and administrative staff who had worked through multiple eras of the institution. Their recollections were as fragmented as they were vivid, stories of patients lost in bureaucratic limbo, of care deferred until it was too late, and of quiet acts of heroism buried beneath the avalanche of modern technology. In hushed conversations during breaks, they recounted events that were seldom spoken of in the harsh light of day. Their words painted a picture of a healthcare system that, in its relentless pursuit of efficiency and sanitized professionalism, had inadvertently discarded the most vulnerable among us. These conversations, often laden with the raw emotion of personal loss, were as compelling as the spectral hints that visited me during my shifts. One evening, as I was completing my rounds with a growing sense of purpose and trepidation, I encountered a moment of surreal confrontation that would forever alter my perspective on what I had been witnessing. I was returning from a particularly long examination of a patient in a dimly lit room, where I had found evidence of neglect hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy and sorrow, when I noticed a figure standing motionless by the far end of the corridor. At first, it looked like one of the elderly patients, but as I moved closer, I realized that this figure did not belong to any living body I knew. The person was translucent, dressed in clothing reminiscent of a bygone era, with eyes that seemed to flicker with both hope and despair. In that split second, the weight of countless untold stories pressed down on me, and I recognized with a jolt that I was face to face with a spirit tethered to these grounds. I recalled the name of a patient I had read about in one of the old files, a young woman who had succumbed to a tragic illness, her pain and pleas stifled by the sterile walls of the hospital. As I reached out with trembling fingers, the apparition slowly dissipated, leaving behind a lingering chill and a profound sense of responsibility. I felt as though that ghostly presence had entrusted me with this sacred duty of bearing witness to the truths that had been hidden away. In the days that followed this encounter, the unit seemed to hum with an almost imperceptible urgency. The wind in the ventilation ducts sounded almost like soft sighs, and the overhead lights cast flickering patterns that danced on the walls like ephemeral memories. Every detail, every sensation, took on a heightened significance as I began to piece together not just the individual narratives, but a broader tapestry of systemic indifference and sorrow. I started to believe that the nocturnal phenomena were a collective outcry, a desperate attempt by forgotten souls to reclaim their rightful memory, to force the living to face the cost of neglect that they had so comfortably absorbed. I would sometimes find myself sitting quietly in a corner, notebooks open and pen trembling in hand, trying to capture the essence of those fleeting moments. Each scribbled note and hastily recorded observation felt like a plea for the past to be acknowledged and for the present to learn from the silent errors of history. Gradually, the unit revealed not just its ghosts, but also the hidden intricacies of its own existence. One humid night, while I was examining a file that detailed the final hours of a patient whose story had been buried under layers of official reports, I noticed a detail that sent shivers down my spine. The records hinted at a network of oversights where critical warnings were drowned out by the clamor of modernity and the relentless pursuit of statistical success. It became painfully clear that the tragic fates of many patients were not isolated incidents, but part of a broader pattern, a pattern of systemic abandonment and clinical detachment. Even as I documented these findings, an eerie silence would descend on the ward as though the very building was holding its breath in anticipation of the truth being laid bare. I recalled nights when, in the midst of routine tasks, I would suddenly feel a burning awareness of eyes upon me, an invisible audience, as if the collective soul of the unit were silently judging my every step. One particularly long night remains seared into my memory. After hours of painstaking work cataloging discrepancies in patient records, I finally decided to step out for a brief respite. The corridors were unusually quiet, bathed in a ghostly light that blurred the line between shadow and substance. I wandered aimlessly, my thoughts heavy with the weight of the uncovered truths, when I came upon an old nurse's station that had been abandoned for years. There, amidst dusty instruments and long-forgotten files, I discovered a small drawer containing a bundle of handwritten letters. Each letter was addressed in careful, looping script, bearing the names of patients whose lives had been shortened by negligence, and each contained a desperate plea for accountability. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, reading every word until the anguished cries and silent promises of these letters intertwined with the quiet rhythm of the night. The documents served not only as a record of past misfortunes, but as a tangible connection to the souls who had once wandered these halls, their voices now echoing in the footsteps of a resident doctor determined to carry their message forward. Over the following weeks, the spectral manifestations grew more deliberate in their presence. I began to sense a duality in the experiences. On one level, there was the haunting melancholy of the unit, a palpable feeling of loss and regret that seemed to hang in the air. On another level, the encounters took on an almost interactive quality, as though the very essence of the past was attempting to communicate with me directly. I recall an instance when, during my routine checks, an old bedside clock began to chime softly at odd intervals. Every time it struck, I heard a fragment of a whisper, a single word carried on the wind, barely audible yet full of meaning. In one such moment, the word "remember" resonated deep within me, stirring emotions that I could no longer ignore. It was as if every creak of the floor, every soft flutter of a curtain, was a deliberate reminder that the past was demanding recognition. In the midst of these escalating mysteries, I found my work becoming more than a mere duty. It evolved into an impassioned quest for redemption. I began reaching out to the families of former patients, piecing together recollections that provided crucial insights into a history many had forgotten. Their grief was palpable, laced with the raw anger of loss, and yet it was tempered by the hope that our stories, when shared, could lead to change. I compiled a silent dossier, a mosaic of records, letters, recorded whispers, and my own eyewitness accounts, each piece a testament to the neglected souls of the unit. Every new discovery filled me with a searing determination that overrode the creeping dread of working alone in the dead of night. I found myself growing increasingly isolated as the relentless pace of my investigations took a toll on my emotional well-being. The hospital corridors no longer offered the transient refuge they once had. Instead, they now felt like the confines of an unseen prison, their edges lined with the specters of the past. There were nights when I would lie awake on the hard cot in the on-call room, the silence punctuated only by the distant sound of my own breathing. In those moments, my mind would replay the ethereal symphony of murmurs and half-formed words, the urgency of a long-dead voice trying to break through the dam of time. I questioned my own sanity, wondering if I had become so enmeshed in the mysteries of the night that I could no longer distinguish between the real and the spectral. But even as the psychological toll mounted, I could not turn away from the truth that beckoned from the shadows. There was a power in those echoes, a reminder that, Beneath the sterile facade of modern healthcare lay the beating hearts and unfinished stories of those who had been forgotten. It was a sobering realization that forced me to confront my own vulnerabilities. The silent toll of sleepless nights, the haunting weight of unspoken regrets, and the bitter realization that sometimes the most significant battles are fought not with scalpels and prescriptions, but with remembrance and accountability. One fateful night, after a particularly grueling shift that left me physically drained and emotionally raw, I found myself once again in the quiet solitude of the unit's central corridor. The atmosphere was thick with an almost tangible presence, and I knew instinctively that I was not alone. As I walked, the temperature around me began to drop gradually, and I could see my breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure, a young woman whose translucent form radiated both an unyielding sorrow and a quiet, desperate plea for vindication. The sight of her, so vivid against the pallid light of the emergency fixtures, sent a shiver down my spine that I could not dispel. In that moment, with a mixture of empathy and determination, I silently promised that I would not allow her memory to fade into oblivion. I approached slowly, each step measured, driven by the conviction that I had been chosen to listen to those who could no longer speak for themselves. There, in that solitary moment beneath the flickering lights, I reached out as if to bridge the divide between our worlds. The figure seemed to regard me with an unfathomable depth, an intensity that conveyed not malice, but a profound sorrow and longing. I whispered reassurances into the heavy silence, promising to bear witness to her pain, to recognize the injustice that had confined her spirit to this endless night. It was a fleeting encounter, yet it resonated with the full force of an entire lifetime of untold stories. As she dissipated like a wisp of smoke in the cold air, I realized that my quest was no longer just about unraveling historical negligence. It was about offering solace, about mending the fractured tapestry of memory with the thread of empathy and accountability. In the weeks and months that followed, the nocturnal visitation continued, each encounter reinforcing the singular mission that had consumed me. I became both caretaker and chronicler, a living repository of the unit's spectral whispers and the unfulfilled promises of the past. My nights, once marked by the clinical routine of examinations and medication rounds, had transformed into a relentless vigil in honor of those voices that could no longer be ignored. Even in moments when the weight of solitude threatened to overwhelm me, I found purpose in every recorded detail, every hushed conversation with a grieving family member, and every inexplicable phenomenon that defied the laws of nature. Now, as I recount these experiences, I am compelled by a quiet urgency to share this narrative with anyone who will listen, a reminder that within the heart of modern medicine lies a repository of suppressed histories, each waiting for its moment to be acknowledged. I continue my work in that dimly lit unit, where every shadow and whisper is an invitation to remember that the past is never dead. The echoes through the night speak to us in a language of sorrow and hope, urging us to bridge the gap between the overlooked and the celebrated, between neglect and recognition. In the relentless quiet of midnight, I have discovered a personal redemption, a solemn duty to honor those who have long been forgotten, whose final breaths were lost amid the clamor of efficiency and indifference. There is an ineffable beauty in the persistence of memory. Each spectral encounter, every softly uttered word in the silence of the corridors, stands as a testament to lives that mattered. I have learned that healing is not solely about treating the body, but also about healing the collective wounds that have accumulated over generations of oversight and sorrow. The unit, with its persistent gloom and enigmatic charm, has become a sanctuary for the voices that linger in its halls, a place where the past and present coexist in a fragile equilibrium. As I continue to traverse these lonely nights, my heart beats not just for the living souls under my care, but also for the ghostly remnants that serve as poignant reminders of what we must never let fade into silence. Tonight, as I wrap up another shift in this spectral space, I stand at the threshold of a window overlooking the city's restless lights. The cool night air carries with it whispers, a quiet chorus that speaks in the language of those left behind. I feel both vulnerable and empowered, a solitary witness tasked with preserving memories too precious to be lost. My pen is my instrument of remembrance, each stroke a promise to record the transient yet eternal symphony of echoes that define these hallowed halls. In the midst of desolation and neglect, I have found purpose. I have come to understand that the true essence of healing extends far beyond physical remedies. It requires an acknowledgement of every story, every tear shed in the silence, every whisper that begs to be heard. And so, I persist. I walk the corridors with a vigilance born of empathy, a commitment to the unseen and the unheard. I have discovered that the echoes through the night do more than haunt. They call us to remember, to reconcile, and to transform a legacy of neglect into one of collective healing. With each new night, I write my own chapter into the annals of this place, a small yet significant tribute to every life that has flickered in the dim light of these corridors. I will continue to listen, to document, and to remind the world that even in the quietest moments, the past persists, urging us to seek justice, compassion, and truth. In every cold draft, every softly murmured name, and every unexplained shadow, there lies a story waiting to be told, a story that, in its raw vulnerability, reshapes our understanding of both life and the silent mysteries that surround us. Thus, as the night deepens and I prepare to embrace another long, reflective shift, I carry with me the solemn assurance that no story, no matter how shrouded in sorrow, will be allowed to vanish without a trace. The echoes in the unit are not merely remnants of bygone eras. They are affirmations of existence, a call to all who can hear, to bear witness, and to heal the wounds of memory with the gentle light of remembrance. And in that light, there is hope, however fragile, that even the darkest nights can give birth to a new dawn of understanding and compassion.